So let me begin by introducing Andrew Blauvelt, who's the curator of architecture and design and chief of communication and audience engagement at the Walker Art Center. He'll be followed by Bryn Smith, who's a second-year student here in the Decrit program.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have to put my timer on. So and I've got text, I've got paper, so it's not set up for me, so we'll make do. So the title of the presentation is Graphic Design, Discipline, Medium, Practice, Tool, or Other. And this was, the talk was kind of crafted together with Bryn, who will be presenting her thesis, which had to do with the contextualization / decontextualization of graphic design as it's presented in galleries and museums. And she had referenced an essay they had written about graphic design in 2002. And it was interesting because I had been thinking about that when I was starting to create another exhibition which opened in 2011 at the Walker that's currently traveling the country about contemporary graphic design. So that's how we met. That was the date. So, if you want if you have to go somewhere, the answer to the question is all of the above. So this was the essay that originally appeared. Actually, it was written for a education conference, and then it made a kind of a revised version. Was published in Emigre magazine. Sorry, let me get back to this. So a little more than a decade ago, I wrote an essay entitled "Towards Critical Autonomy: Or Can Graphic Design Save Itself?" And I should also note that I'm a educated, trained, practicing graphic designer. A version of it was subsequently published in Emigre's Rant issue, which was number 64. And to frame that issue, the editor of Emigre, Rudy Vanderlens, had posed the question, are young designers writing passionately enough about what they do? Apparently, the implied answer was no, since he invited a handful of former contributors from their heyday of Emigre in the 1990s to become, in effect, the kind of cranky old men that those writers once criticized. So Vanderlyn sought to challenge a new, younger generation of designers to adopt a more critical attitude towards their own work and that of others, a kind of pay-it-forward criticism. Whoops. Goofed already. The focus of my rant, however, was that graphic design had become an amorphous blob, not the neo-organicism of the spline curve or parametric modeling in architecture, for example, like this by Future Systems, or even a 3D model typography that was in vogue in the 1990s. Rather, I was thinking of the body of graphic design in a more disciplinary sense, its corpus as having something soft and ill-defined, say something closer to the Stay-Puffed Marshmallow Man of Ghostbusters fame, bloated, not so nimble, and maybe even menacing. Graphic design's millennial bloat, actually we can fixate on him for a while. Graphic design's millennial bloat was accompanied by other symptoms, including a rapid expansion of different types of graphic design practice, brought on mostly because of the introduction of the personal computer and the creation of the internet, the commercial internet, which of course greatly extended the communication frontier from print to screen-based media and from one-way messages in a bottle to feedback loops of interactivity. Graphic design's lethargy, however, was a reflection of a lack of critical discourse, as many of its most potent voices, which had emerged from the profession, which is interesting, criticism emerging from practitioners. But these practitioners, such as our critics like myself, had re-engaged in design practice when the economy took off in the mid to late 90s. One reason that most of the writing about graphic design comes from graphic designers is that no one really cares. And I'm joking, sort of. Frankly, there are few non-designers who are being paid to write about the subject. Besides, we all know the pecking order in the traditional criticism industry, which is not architecture on top, it's actually fashion, followed by architecture, by which we mean interiors, by which they mean kitchens and bathrooms. And then there's product design, by which they mean Apple. And then there's graphic design, by which they mean street art, I think. But what really invigorated the period of, some say, the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s in graphic design was a heady combination of intense formal experimentation and genuine skepticism of the profession, which was fomented mostly in the academy, which is interesting, not necessarily in the profession, at programs like those at maybe Cranbrook or CalArts or other places, whose graduates did not see themselves participating in the prevailing version of conventional mainstream graphic design. Graduating mostly in recessionary times, which sounds a little familiar, the jobs were scarce, but the ambition was plentiful. By the mid-1990s, however, there seemed to be no clear way forward after an intense period of cultural postmodernism and stylistic pluralism, other than the technological euphoria surrounding the internet, which would soon collapse in the dot-bomb era. Or, alternately, a recuperation of modernism, which seemed to many people, I guess including myself, as being too early at best or too nostalgic at worst. I think I'd like to read an excerpt from the essay. Here it is. I'll have to read, I guess it's so crisp that you can actually read it, so it's kind of one of these weird dilemmas. Do I read it or do I let you read it? I'll try reading it, since I don't like to read slides. But the essay begins with a quote by critic Hal Foster about the art scene of the 1980s. And here, when I read it, you can replace the word art for graphic design. Art today exists today in a state of pluralism. No style or even mode of art is dominant, and no critical position is orthodox. Yet this state is also a position, and this position is an alibi. As a general condition, pluralism tends to absorb argument, which is not to say that it does not promote antagonisms of all sorts. One can only begin out of discontent with the status quo, for in a pluralist state, art and criticism tend to be dispersed and so rendered impotent. Minor deviation is allowed only in order to resist radical change, unquote. Now, Foster's commentary about pluralism in the 80s art scene could be easily applied to contemporary graphic design, at least at that moment. Significant aesthetic debates had been superseded by consensus, not a fight over which style, but agreement on all styles. The fundamental principle of pluralism asks not in what style we should design, but rather that we design stylishly. Now, a plethora of these benign styles exist to mix or match according to the logic of the marketplace. Once, however, style was a defining gesture, unapologetically ideological, and a signal that differentiated and codified its subject. Today, style has been reduced to a matter of choice, not a matter of conviction, but rather one of convenience. In the essay, I go on to talk about the leveling process that has transformed this idea of stylistic pluralism as being rampant within, say, the discipline itself, and particularly its practice, and that eventually would level and kind of turn onto the same par many of the things that made the profession once some more distinct, like professional organizations, publications, schools, and even competitions. Now, which could be pretty much interchangeable with one another by this point. The situation of academic and marketplace pluralism, as well as the dearth of critical discourse, are actually related phenomenon, each reflecting the condition of the other. Slowly but surely, any critical edge to design, either real or imagined, has largely disappeared, dulled by neglect in the go-go 90s or deemed expendable in the subsequent downswing. However, the reason seems not a factor of cyclical economies, but rather a transfiguration of the critical avant-garde into a post-critical rearguard. So, and here's the key point, I guess, that gets back to the bloat. It is no wonder that today that graphic design feels like a vast formless body, able to absorb any blows delivered to it, lacking coherency and increasingly dispersed. This absence of a critical mass or resistant body is at the heart of the current malaise. Now, one might argue that graphic design then, or today, no longer exists in the form or material body we once knew it. It's so scattered and destabilized are its constituent elements that any attempt at definitions becomes meaningless. The expansion of graphic design beyond its roots in print is simply one symptom of this crisis. Even a broad moniker such as communication design loses cohesion in the face of multitudes of providers producing all sorts of communication for divergent media, be it print, television, video, film, or the internet. Lacking the specificity of a medium, graphic design tends to be identified more through its very products than any sense of disciplinary practice. Because of this, graphic design is reduced to its commodity form, simply a choice of vehicles for delivering a message: ad, billboard, book, brochure, typeface, website, and so on. Implicit in this reductive understanding is the denial of graphic design as a disciplinary practice, and with it the possibility of disciplinary autonomy. Now, what was interesting for me about that, and it seems that Dunne Raby is our touchstone today, because in that particular article, in trying to open up a space for what might be a critical practice, I had drawn upon their distinction between, say, critical design and experimental design. If the 1980s and the 1990s were paramount in the experimentation brought on by graphic designers, that had, at that point, had reproduced a marketplace stylistic pluralism. However, there was another avenue that was possible, and that had to do with Dunne Raby's questioning of this, the kind of paramount nature of experimental design in favor of something else that they would call critical design. But I think most importantly, they carved a space for parallel exploration of object design. Notice I didn't say product design, that did not need to affirm the logic of product design or industrial design, either in terms of conventional professional practice or societal expectations. In my argument, I posit that graphic design, in order to save itself, needed to create a more autonomous space in order to preserve a sense of what critic Hal Foster in his book, Design and Crime, had dubbed running room. Of course, Foster doesn't understand that design would have any potential to create running room in the culture, and that's a task reserved for art, and we can debate that, and that's a totally different rant, about a different critic-to-critic rant. But room for something else, other types of practices that could throw the field into a more critical, reflexive, or even metacritical light, not only for criticism, but also for practice. Because as part of the problem, this was actually an excerpt from a poster I created for AIGA around the same time that was looking at the expansion of graphic design. When you're in graphic design, you always use the word design, but you always mean, you use it generally, but it actually means graphic design. So when it says designers, it's actually graphic designers. And the kind of, we call this the furball of graphic design practice at the turn of the millennium, in which there was a rapid expansion away from this kind of traditional notion about what a graphic designer might be or the things they may do. So you could have illustration, font design, motion graphics, information design, packaging design, publication design, branding, web design, interaction design. Now you could have service design, systems design. These lists keep going on and on. And fortunately, or unfortunately, you can track all of this in academic program listings for schools, because now it's impossible to teach all of this. So now you must specialize in some of it. And it's like trying to wage a war on too many fronts. This kind of weakens rather than strengthens the idea of disciplinary coherency. And perhaps most importantly, very few of those practices are either critical or self-reflexive. Now I can enter into a kind of more critical, self-critical opportunity to reflect back on that essay and what it might mean today. A major missing element for my argument for understanding graphic design as a discipline, however, was the fundamental concept whereby the discipline not only sets the terms of the discussion because it generates and defines its own languages, such as verbal ones like technical jargon, or even visual ones like styles. And because they do this, they own and thus control the knowledge of production, the production of knowledge, sorry. So, for instance, the International Astronomical Union gets to decide the names of all celestial bodies. And you may remember in 2006, they voted Pluto off the planetary island, which was quite astounding as a layperson, because you think, can they do that? And yes, they can. So, but that's real power and authority within the discipline, right? However, because graphic design has no entry requirements to speak of for professional practice, and because largely the mysterious processes of creating graphic design, or what used to be mysterious and invisible, had been exposed and promoted through the desktop publishing revolution, any slim hope for gatekeeping to enter the field evaporated. So the great democratization of design could not be contained any longer. And I also like to point out that, the digital revolution really impacted graphic designers first and foremost because of this. Other industries were very slow to catch on, eventually product design and architecture, for example. Now, by democratizing design, I don't mean the IKEA version of democratic design or, trying to make design available for everyone. It's really the notion that you would open up the tools and the processes and some kind of basic knowledge about the field and then be sharing that or distributing that or appropriating it through technology or software. Do a time check, sorry. And so I'm heading into the troubled territory that Paola warned me about, or warned us about. So because of the technological revolution that occurred, and whether justified or not, the graphic design profession pivoted on its own discourse. And they exchanged the rhetoric of expertise and authority for more business-friendly, value-added propositions that clients would easily sign on to. If graphic design were being made available to the masses in the form of a box of software, then graphic design could not be presented merely as a tool, a means, and an end unto itself. So the technological juggernaut that shook up the field of graphic design recast the practice, at least in the public's eyes, as a kind of pro-am or professional amateur expertise using a new creative toolbox available to anyone who could pay for the software or snag a bootleg copy for themselves. The immediate need for users to create, make, and produce their own content recast the idea of graphic design as a kind of integrated synthetic digital tool. And sure, you become a professional at it too if you were good at it by making a living off of it. In other words, other people would pay you for it. So it allowed some entry and access to the field. Now, graphic design could also be understood as a kind of medium, and the way that design itself could be understood as a medium, although I don't believe that it actually is a medium, but that didn't stop artists from attempting to do so. We can't substitute the word graphic design for offset lithography, for example, even though, like, say, most graphic design is printed, so those two terms are not synonymous, so it's not really a medium. But by the late 80s and the early 90s, design, meaning graphic, product, and architecture, was being appropriated as a kind of holistic medium unto itself by other visual artists. In the past, artists who had worked as designers could bring that knowledge with them of knowledge of process and their inner workings into their new pursuits. So you could have people like James Rosenquist bringing billboard techniques into his pop art, or Ed Ruscha, who had done book design, making photo books, or even Barbara Kruger, who had been a picture editor, doing her new collages. But a new generation of artists found design itself quotable in toto. So people like Andrew Blauvelt, Jorge Pardo, and Pei White, for example, these figures synthesize the nature of the design artifact, the embodiment, concept, technique, form, material, use, and social context, and had been so clearly articulated and resolved that it can now be appropriated or quoted for their artwork. So in retrospect, I think the proliferation of graphic design practices, which are once seen as problematic, could be seen from today's perspective as being quote unquote multidisciplinary, expansions of knowledge across many new areas and fronts, even if they seem just like new commodity forms. The subsequent feelings about loss of control could be understood in terms of themes today, such as democratization or the appropriation of professional skills and practical knowledge, or maybe even the expropriation of mediums, such as the artists I just showed, depending on who's doing the taking, who's doing the receiving. The field of graphic design seems particularly susceptible to existential crises. Fields such as architecture, landscape architecture, and product design have had more stable disciplinary frameworks, particularly in museological or curatorial terms. Graphic design seems almost elsewhere in exhibitions, kind of fugitive or ephemeral materials, supporting evidence, documentation, archival materials, everything but the main event itself. So interestingly, in his 2008 obituary for Mildred Jean Constantine, the longtime MoMA curator, Stephen Heller notes the pivotal role that she played in attaining museum status for graphic design. Her 1968 exhibition, Word and Image, was a landmark show, placing poster design front and center in the museum's galleries. And her approach worked. Soon the poster form was the preeminent representation of graphic design in all museums and in their collections. Another Mildred, this one Mildred Friedman, the design curator at the Walker Art Center, organized the first large-scale museum exhibition about graphic design in 1989. Entitled Graphic Design in America, Visual Language History, the show was arranged in sections by commercial and non-commercial sectors, things like design for the environment, design for commerce, etc. Unlike previous shows, it included an expansive array of materials, books, magazines, logos, letterheads, maps, newspapers, etc. In many ways, it was perfectly timed and attuned to its times. The profession of graphic design really entered its historical reflexive period in the 1980s with a series of books and conferences devoted to its past. In the throes of postmodernism, the focus on history of American graphic design was viewed as timely and useful, even if that history wasn't exactly reflective of all the major currents and players involved in creating that history. It was also a legitimating show for the profession because it gave a field a past and a history and identity, which by implication meant that it could have a future. It was alive. But it was also prophetic because it would include the first traces of the personal computer, which had been introduced just a few years earlier in 1984. And it would take to 1996, however, for the second major museum exhibition about graphic design, this one curated by Ellen Lupton at the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, Mixing Messages, Graphic Design and Contemporary Culture. And Ellen, who had worked partially on the Graphic Design in America show, picked up where that show had left off. This show would be contemporary, not historical. It would talk about graphic design in the context of popular culture, a theme that was prevalent at that particular time and marked by, for example, cultural analysis shows like Kurt Varnadot's 1990s show at MoMA, High and Low, Modern Art and Popular Culture. So these exhibitions of graphic design tend to be markers for the historical zeitgeist that was reflected in the profession. So, in 2011, I worked with Ellen Lupton and some other curators to organize this exhibition called Graphic Design Now in Production. The point of the show, or a sub-theme within the show, is the idea that the expansion of the graphic design field isn't solely predicated on the expansion of its various forms that it might take, but rather on the appropriation and the kind of blurring of boundaries between different practices that the graphic designer has taken. So when you see the designer, you can read graphic designer. So the graphic designer as author, for example, is a theme that started in the 1980s, but was really played out in this decade. Because you could also have just graphic designers acting as editors, meaning dealing with content, with images, with text. You could also have them as publishers, meaning that they control all the means of production in book formation and publishing. The figure of the designer as producer was largely the theme of the show, and that was presciently argued by Ellen in 1998, actually, in this essay that was reproduced in the catalog. But you could also have more contemporary manifestations, the idea of the graphic designer as entrepreneur, as the business person, controlling all aspects of both conception and production and distribution. The designer is a new kind of programmer. This is a piece by Luss that uses computer algorithms in order to generate up to 600 poster designs in a day. And it's projected, not printed. Or the designer as archivist, somebody scavenging information. If the problem with big data is the big problem for big business, big data and personal data becomes another mine to mine? Yeah, for graphic designers, this by Nicholas Felton. Or the idea of other people using graphic design. So in the new genres of visual journalism, for example, data and information setting in the visual storytelling realm is a whole new form of communication that's being tested out by many journalists and statisticians, as well as graphic designers. If the graphic designer used to be known as an expert in the tool, So you could have someone who really knew their Photoshop or really knew their layout programs. The new graphic designer is actually a tool maker, somebody generating open source code for other people to use and to adapt and to add on to. This is Jörg Lenny. And of course, the graphic designer as curator. The idea of using curatorial practice is another extension of their own practice in order to carve out a critical space for the engagement of various content, obviously, since the shows will vary. The designer as storyteller, whether that's analog technology like the whiteboard technique invented in England used at the RSA for illustrating lectures, for example, or in new forms of technology in interpretation, in data projection. The designer as teacher, and of course designers have always been teachers, but this is a more informal way of thinking about teaching. And even the designer as artist, someone who trained in design, graphic design, but now is essentially working as an artist. The designer as researcher, another hot area for practice where the designer is essentially their own client, right? So we get rid of the traditional confines around graphic design. And then finally, the design as enabler. These are designers who are creating design for other people to intervene in, to produce, to add content to, so that the traditional notion of having a final and very clear object of design is shifted. It's becoming much more uncontrollable, I think is the key word. So I think in the end, just as the tools and practice of graphic design itself were appropriated and dispersed, the graphic designer now has appropriated the roles of others in various systems of production. So the idea is that turnaround is fair play. By expanding a range of possible practices, graphic design finds itself dispersed as a decade ago. However, the critical space or running room is opened in all the seams and fault lines of adjacent and not so adjacent practices. And by expanding graphic design as we once knew it, we might save it after all. Thank you.